Welcome back, everyone. My name is Declan O'Flaherty, and this is the Micromath Capital Podcast. Today, I am joined with Greg Beischer, President and CEO of Alaska Energy Metals. Greg, how are you doing today?
Doing great, Declan. Thanks for the invite.
Well, thank you for joining me. Well, let's jump right into it. So, we've been covering Alaska Energy Metals for quite some time, and 2024 has been filled with many exciting developments. But for those who may not be as familiar, why don't you provide a brief overview of the company?
Yeah, I'll just give you a quick summary version. We started the company just 2 years ago on a nickel sulfide project here in Alaska, which is my home base. I've been exploring all over this state for about 30 years now, and I actually started on this nickel project in the 1990s when I was a young geologist working for Inco, which at the time was the largest nickel miner in the world out of Sudbury, Ontario. We discovered nickel back then, but it wasn't high enough grade. But I realized a couple of years ago that the nickel market was going to take off, that nickel was going to become into huge demand, and that there was definitely some large tonnage, though modest grade, at our Nikolai Project. So we reacquired all the mineral rights and started the company, and we've raised money, drilled some holes, and it turns out it's an enormous nickel deposit, and it's very homogeneous. It's just a flat tabular body that just keeps going, and we've established already that there's more than 8 billion with a B, pounds of nickel in the ground, and other strategic metals as well, including cobalt, chromium, and platinum and palladium. So, to have a large deposit of this nature on American soil, secure domestic production, I think is going to be really important going forward. And we've got the goods. We've got a great deposit. It's near infrastructure. So, the development logistics are pretty good. A lot of Alaska is very remote, but our project is not. It's about a 6-hour drive on paved highways from my house.
hmm Well, let's double click on kind of you touched about how demand is really driving up, especially for domestic production. Why is that? Why has demand increased so substantially? And how is Alaska Energy Metals positioned towards that?
Sure. Yeah. And demand really is going up. I mean, year over year, it's in double digits, at least 10% or more. It's over 20% this past year. I mean, that's a lot of nickel being consumed. And, people should understand the main use for nickel still is the manufacture of stainless steel. Just alloy a bit of nickel and chromium, and you make beautiful stainless steel. But there's all kinds of uses for nickel, extremely important metal in aerospace applications, defense applications. It's got a really high melting point. It's really resistant to corrosion, which give it these amazing properties. But there's a whole new use now, and that's in lithium-ion batteries. I mean, we call them lithium-ion batteries, but the reality is there's a lot more nickel in that battery than there is lithium. And I can tell you as a geologist that nickel's a lot harder to find than lithium is. So, there on the average in a passenger car EV, there's about 64 pounds or 29 kilos just in the battery of nickel. So it's a whole new use that's creating a lot of demand on top of stainless and the other applications, which still grow year over year as our population grows. So does the demand for nickel for those uses. So the demand is huge. And so you'd think that the price of nickel would be way up as a consequence, but so far it's not, because Indonesia, which already was a fairly big nickel producer, with assistance from China, has been able to ramp up and even flood the market with nickel. So the nickel price is soft right now, despite all the demand, but it's not sustainable. They won't be able to keep up. Most of the reading I do shows that there will be supply deficits by 2026, and that'll make the price move again.
Interesting. Well, and that kind of speaks to what you had briefly mentioned before in regards to your updated mineral resource estimate. So you came out after a 2023 drill program and released some new and really high or promising results from it. So, could you speak more to this mineral resource update and then also just discuss the quality and how it kind of compares to comparative businesses within the North American industry?
Sure thing. Yeah. Yeah, so as I mentioned, it's a very homogeneous deposit and it's thick. I mean, this thing is 300 meters thick. Every time we drill through it, we get almost the same result from section to section. We move over 300 meters, we drill again. The assay results are very, very similar every time. And so that's very attractive to mining companies to mine on a bulk scale. So the sort of a parallel would be copper porphyries. And, back in the 60s, mining companies realized we could make a lot of money by doing this sort of very large scale mining, bulk tonnage, big trucks, big mill, move a lot of rock and process it to get the disseminated, weakly disseminated sulfide out of that rock. And it's the same situation here. The deposit as it stands now is known to be more than 4 kilometers long. We think it's even larger than that. It goes to unknown depth, wide open. But like I mentioned, it's 300 meters thick. So we've built up huge tonnage, even with just one season of drilling. We've done another season now. So before February, we'll be increasing our resource. As I mentioned, there's almost 4 billion pounds of nickel already in the indicated category and more than 4 billion pounds in the inferred category. So if you add it up, I'm not really allowed to combine those two categories of resource, but if you were to add them in your head, it's over 8 billion pounds of nickel documented in the ground. And I can tell you that after we recalculate our resource in February, that number will be substantially larger. We just announced assay results from 2 holes that we had drilled this summer. Yeah, just like the other holes, except that there's a core to the deposit. It's like a layer cake. And right in the center, the concentration of mineralization or grade is a little bit higher. And so we've traced that higher grade mineralization with this summer's drilling program.
Interesting.
I think that's going to be very important on the economics going forward. But yeah, you can look forward to more assay results next week, and then about 6 weeks from now, a recalculation of the mineral resource. And at that point, I think we'll be able to very confidently say that this is the largest nickel deposit in the continental United States. It's got other critical metals, and copper's not necessarily on the list, but there's copper in there too that's likely to be recovered, cobalt, and then chromium, platinum, and palladium. And so, America, I think, is coming to realize that it's really vulnerable, that it's given up metal supply chains, and that those metals could be weaponized. And China's shown that to us just this week, retaliating to the threat of tariffs by saying, okay, well, we're not going to sell antimony to you anymore. So, this country could find itself in a lot of trouble in a very short order if some sort of trade dispute or trade war develops around the world. There's a lot of geopolitics at play right now, as you know.
Yeah, and it would be fair to say then that a lot of this pressure, say globally, will incentivize not just short-term production, but long-term production as well, just to build a general independence from North America. Is that fair to assume in this regard?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, uh, I see actually in the U.S. right now bipartisan support. Both Democrats and Republicans on Capitol Hill in Washington recognize that our country is vulnerable and that we've given up these supply lines. The government has not been supportive of domestic mining operations, but it's changing in a hurry now because the realization has come of how vulnerable we are. And so I think you'll see in the coming administration strong support for developing domestic mining projects. The prior administration or the outgoing one, was very pro electrification, which is great. I think we should diversify our energy, but it wasn't the current administration wasn't necessarily being supportive of domestic mining. It was supportive of electrification and maybe refining of metals in the U.S. But now I think we'll see clear support for domestic mining. And here we have a tremendous resource on American soil in Alaska.
Well, you really do. And just speaking to the utility of nickel too, I think it is fundamentally important that we do start to transition just because of how much value it does to provide. Now, shifting back our attention towards the Nikolai Project, you actually recently announced a new partnership with the Colorado School of Mines and Virginia Polytechnic Institute. And I was curious if you could kind of touch on it because it's providing a different element to the project itself and where the value might be unlocked from this new partnership.
Yeah, so it's an interesting thing. Nickel occurs in very few geologic environments, and it's almost always associated with what us geologists call ultramafic rocks. So these are rocks that are naturally very high in magnesium. And the interesting thing is when you expose these rocks to air, to the atmosphere, they spontaneously react with carbon dioxide in the air. So the magnesium reacts with carbon dioxide to form magnesium carbonate. And therefore, the carbon contained in the carbon dioxide becomes locked in the rock. And so it's a way where carbon can be captured or sequestered. And, if you just put a ultramafic rock on the table, it'll turn brown pretty quickly because it's reacting with the air. But you can imagine in the mining process for the disseminated nickel, we've crushed that rock. We've ground it to the consistency of baby powder, thereby exposing all those grains of rocks to the atmosphere. And so a lot of carbon could be captured that way. And so we've partnered with the Colorado School of Mines and Virginia Tech to be able to quantify that carbon capture rate. It'll be important for us to know if we have a ton of tailings from processed nickel ore, how much carbon could be captured within that ton and therefore locked in the tailings that are discarded. So that's the nature of the work we're partnering with them on that. And, conceivably, if we're able to capture a lot of carbon, it will work towards making a mining operation carbon neutral, potentially, or even carbon negative, and maybe there's even carbon credits that can be sold and actually help with the economics of a mining operation. So it's an interesting component to the project, really, that could ultimately be very, very important, even on the economic side, and plus, doing something that's potentially helpful to the environment and the effort to slow global warming from carbon dioxide generated from fossil fuels.
Really, it's quite interesting. Just it speaks to the potential of the project overall and the capability. And so, yeah, it'll be interesting to see how this develops because there certainly is a lot of excitement, as you even mentioned, about carbon credit opportunities as well. And so, if it does unlock additional value, it could be substantial, which is great. Now, shifting our attention from away from the Nikolai project, let's focus on your secondary project, the Angler's Belleterre Nickel Copper Project in Quebec. This is a second highly potential prospect, and perhaps you could speak to why the company sought to acquire this project and how they've been developing it so far.
Yeah, well, it's a very similar story as Nikolai in that it's an area that I had studied when I was a young geologist working for a big nickel company, Inco, and I was stationed for a few years in northern Quebec, and I researched this particular area where our Anglier project is situated, and I was able to obtain the mineral rights. It's earlier stage, and so we've done the basic surveys, airborne electromagnetic surveys and magnetics, and a great big soil geochemical sampling program. And we're just digesting all those results right now. And it's very clear already that there's going to be some compelling drill targets come out of that work. That we'll look to drill at some point next year. They probably need some ground geophysics before they're really ready to go. But yeah, solid targets for sure.
Right. So maybe you could just touch on some of these various different studies, like the Mineral Potential Index and the airborne studies. What are the purpose of these various studies, and what insights do they provide for you and the company?
Well, yeah, I mean, we have to use all the tools in our toolbox to try and find that big prize. And so geologists use everything from data that's sensed from satellites, from airplanes, helicopters, and then ground sensors. We research the geology, the public domain information, historical information, compile it all together and use this information all together to develop a hypothesis of where that nickel copper deposit could be. And then we test our hypothesis by drilling holes into the earth, collecting core samples. And so we've gone through most of the base steps first, and next year we'll be ready to drill there.
Very interesting. And I suppose with this project as well, you also had just recently released some more even potential exciting news. There was a discovery made by Quebec Innovative Materials not far from your property, and it discovered potential accumulations of white hydrogen. So what does that do for Alaska Energy Metals? And if it is found on the property, what kind of value add would that bring to the company?
Yeah. Let's be clear. We're keeping our focus on nickel. That's what we know best, but we should never, geologists should always keep an open mind about any opportunity. But yeah, Quebec Innovative owns claims immediately adjacent to our Anglier claims, and they announced the discovery of anomalous conditions, hydrogen gas at elevated levels in soil at surface or just below surface. That potentially indicates at least it indicates the possibility that there's pockets or reservoirs of geologically derived hydrogen gas trapped below surface that could be tapped and then used in a new clean energy source, fuel. And it's actually a fairly new concept altogether. But there's one thing for sure. And that is that the ultramafic rocks, again, that are present on our project in Quebec, when they're metamorphosed, altered, serpentinized is the term, hydrogen gas is one of the products of serpentinization. So we have the rocks that could have produced hydrogen gas, but like in any sort of oil and gas type situation, you need pathways for the gas to migrate from the source, and then a reservoir, which is porous rock with a seal on top of it, permeable there. So, yeah, there's a number of geologic conditions that would all have to come together to keep that gas trapped there for millions of years. Um, so, we noticed took great interest in Quebec Innovative's announcements, especially because their stock price really shot up right after that, and so we've directed a few tens of thousands of dollars towards evaluating that potential on our ground and just see if it's worth pursuing further.
Right. So certainly some additional potential opportunities there to build on the main focus of nickel. That is the key focus of both your projects. And so perhaps just to close out this interview, maybe you could discuss what you're most excited about in regards to Alaska Energy Metals for the next year and what investors could have or look forward to in the coming year.
Yeah. Well, as I mentioned, we'll do an update to our mineral resource estimate based on the 4 holes that we drilled this past summer. And it should be a substantial increase in the metal content. But the other component to that is we'll also be announcing the results of the metal recovery studies that we've been doing. I mean, it's great to have this huge deposit, but we have to know how much of the metals are actually recoverable in it. And since it is a polymetallic deposit, it's nickel, but it's got other accessory metals but that contribute to the value of the deposit. But we have to know, well, how many of those would we collect? What concentrates would be formed. So there's lots of experimentation and testing to do, but the initial work is nearing completion. And so we'll announce that. And once we have these 2 pieces of information, we know that we have an enormous deposit. And if the metal recovery rates are reasonably high, then we can start to prove the economics, prove that this could be mined profitably. And so we would move into a preliminary economic assessment stage and complete a PEA as soon as reasonably feasible in 2025. And at that point, that's when we can start to expect to attract more major investors, strategic partners that can help with various aspects of the project, including finance, but also potentially others that can contribute expertise as well. So we'll look to forming strategic alliances in the coming year as well. The other thing that could be an absolute game changer for us is the possibility of a government grant. I mean, the United States has realized it's vulnerable, particularly the Department of Defense in the United States. That agency of the government has been awarding grants to companies. For example, Graphite One, which owns an exciting graphite project here in Western Alaska, received a grant in excess of $30 million. And I think our project certainly qualifies. In fact, our applications have been accepted as of interest. We haven't been invited yet to do a full-blown proposal. Things have been a little bit on hold through the election cycle, but I expect in 2025 our project will get a thorough review. And if it's successful, it could make a tremendous difference and really accelerate our timeframes towards development.
Interesting. So to summarize, once this new information comes out about your latest drilling programs and you gather that and put it towards a preliminary economic assessment in the coming months and year, then it'll really set you up for larger scale investments as well as support from the government potentially. That's correct?
Exactly, and but this is all on the backdrop of a depressed nickel price, and so, but with the prospect that by 2026 the nickel price should be moving higher again. That's provided that there hasn't been some major geopolitical shift that suddenly changes metal prices. So. When you get all those things going at once, then I think there's a really good potential for our share price to move upwards as well. But you know that in our business, in the mining business in particular, it's always best to be a contrarian. So now is the time to chip away, build a position in our company. Over time, dollar cost forward averaging, so that your average cost, if you pick shares up over the next several months, the payoff could be substantial when everything comes together later this year, early
Yeah,
next year.
absolutely. Absolutely. Like if anything, this is the time prior to all the catalysts, the economic catalysts lining up and positioning Alaska Energy Metals for the long run. So no, it's very, very exciting. And I mean, it seems like there's a lot of developments happening moving forward with the company and that have happened over the past year. So it's certainly interesting to, and something investors should really dive into because like you said, there's a lot of value that this company brings, and you can learn a lot about the industry and how they're going to position themselves for the long term surrounding as we push towards more domestic nickel development and production. So it's great, and thank you, Greg, for really providing all this information, and it was a privilege just to speak with you today. And if you have any final thoughts here, I'll leave it up to you, and then we can close things out.
My pleasure, Declan. It's been great for me to see investors your age starting to come into the mining market. When I was your age, it seems like speculative investments really were mining, oil and gas, resource industries. Nowadays, there's a lot of speculative investments available to the investor. But the one great thing about mining is it's very, very cyclical. And so when you identify a commodity that's low in price, you just got to know that at one point it's going to go a lot higher. And so buy low, sell high.
That's right. And it certainly helps when you get a chance to speak to somebody like you too, because you get that extra insight and just good perspective on the industry at large. So thanks again. It was a great privilege to talk to you, and I hope we can do it again soon.
My pleasure, Declan, anytime.